morning. It's great to see so many people in the room at a live conference. It's been a while since that happened for everyone. I'm going to say first that I'm very excited to be here at Dentsu Connect 2022, and thanks to Dentsu for giving us, at The Economist, the opportunity to speak. I'm going to start with a story of a taxi driver. I think everybody has a taxi driver story somewhere. Taxi drivers are very chatty all over the world. When I made my first trip out of Singapore, I'm based there, to come to KL after the pandemic, I got into a taxi on the way to the airport, and the taxi driver asked me, what do you do for a living? And I said, well, I'm an economist. And he said, you guys, you get things wrong all the time, right? You tell me that China is going to crash, it's still there. You tell me that Trump is going to lose and he wins. You tell me that Trump is going to win and then he loses. You tell me that inflation is going away. I still cannot buy my chicken in the market. They're all stuck in Malaysia. What's going on? All I can say is that I was pretty glad that I lived quite close to the airport that day, and that ride was over fast. But, there was something that I took away. There's a sense of gloom. When I talk to people in the room like yourselves, when I talk to our clients, a sense of gloom is coming, and the question they ask us is there a recession coming, and what can we do about it? And so I'll give you the answers up front. There's reason to be gloomy. There's the war in Ukraine. We are just coming out of a pandemic. The softening growth in Europe. Inflation is high. The US doesn't look very good either. And China is still closed. All of those are dragging the world economy down. We are somewhat protected here in Southeast Asia and especially in Indonesia. And I'll go through the presentation and I'll tell you why. Very quickly today, I'll do a macroeconomic outlook, then I'll look at the region in Asia, look at Indonesia, and then after that, a quick look at developing trends in 2023. This is our chart of global growth. So all the hexagons represent all the countries in the world. And on the right, you can see the chart. So the more red you are on top. That's higher economic growth at about 7%. As growth cools, it goes down to a blue color. So you can see generally from a pictorial sense where growth is going to come from. If you look on the left of the chart, North America, South America, growth is pretty blue, a lot of blue areas there. Europe is also down. Some spots of activity in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, South Africa, those countries are benefiting from the commodities boom and from supply chain reallocations. And then China, as you can see, that blue color, China has never been that color before, only growing at 3.3% this year. So global growth of 2.7% in 2022, we've revised that down from 4% since the Ukraine war. Next year, unfortunately, it doesn't look much better. So we think that world GDP growth will be around 1.9%. If you look at Europe, you can see a lot of that blue, light blue has turned into dark blue. That's even lower growth. We think Europe will be in a recession next year. Some of the red and brown colors have changed a little bit, but look at Southeast Asia. There's still a fair amount of yellow and red going on there. So we are still seeing some good news in Southeast Asia. This is the same numbers from before, so it's still world growth, but separated by different regions. So the blue bar is growth in 2022, the light blue is growth next year in 2023, and the yellow is growth in 2024. So you can see how growth is changing, and at the bottom there are the different regions, right? So on the left is the world GDP growth. As you can see, it goes down next year, and then it comes up in 2024, but not by much, around the same as it does this year. Look at the Eurozone, negative growth there. Next year, we're looking at 0.4% negative growth. Countries like Austria, Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, the UK, all will be negative growth for the full year. We define a recession as 2 quarters. In Europe, that's going to be the full year. That's on the back of the energy crisis that we are seeing in Europe. But look in the center there at APAC, pretty high and also pretty consistent, right? So growth of just under 4% in APAC across the region. That's pretty good news for us. Of course, in Middle East and North Africa and in Sub-Saharan Africa, also high growth, but of course those economies are much smaller than the rest of the world. Now, lots of words and lots of colors here on the chart. Let me draw your attention to a couple of things. One is you don't need to look at all the different lines and all the different colors, but on the left-hand side, we have soft commodities, so beverages and grains and sugar. On the middle, we have harder commodities, so fibers and metals and rubber. And on the right, we have oil prices. That black dot that you see is where we are now in 2022. And the story to take away from here is that prices are falling, right? So these are commodity prices and they're coming down, right? So generally you can see everything that we plant, which is on the left, those things are coming down by 10, 15%. They're coming down faster. That's because there are harvest cycles, so it's 6 or 12 months. It doesn't take long for prices to readjust. Things that we dig out of the ground, base metals and fibers, things that take a bit longer to produce, those are coming down too, but at a slower rate. And then, of course, oil prices are coming down. The two reasons for this, one is that we are sorting out some of the supply chain bottlenecks that is causing inflation, so that's good. But also, as I showed you in the chart before, global growth is coming down, and so these things are slowing as well. Now, we think that prices will remain elevated over the next 5 years because the war in Ukraine will last for the next 5 years. That's our prediction at the EIU. We think that it will look like how it's looked like in the last 6 or 7 months, and that Russia will still be effectively off the market, which puts a lot more grit into the process. Now, going on, these are conventional indicators like GDP, oil prices, commodity prices. Let's look at some unconventional indicators like lipstick and underwear. So that light blue line there that you see on the top is men's underwear sales in North America, in the US. And then the blue line that you see on the bottom is women's lipstick sales also in the US. Now, and then the yellow bars are GDP growth. Why have I chosen this? Because I think it's when you're looking for growth, when you're looking for different types of indicators, you need to kind of spread around a little bit more. Men also are very practical people. So, when times are good, they buy a lot of underwear. When times are looking bad, they basically stop buying underwear, right? Because nobody sees them wearing the underwear unless they are in the locker room. Very practical people, men are. So as you can see, underwear sales are going down in the US. That's not a particularly good sign. And lipstick, right? So women, during a recession, they tend to put off more expensive luxury items like dresses or expensive perfumes, things like that. But lipstick is something that they consider a little luxury. And so they tend to buy that, even though, and that tends to increase during the time of recession. Now, those numbers were flat during COVID, obviously, because everybody wore a mask. But the story to take away here is that men's underwear sales are going down and women's cosmetics are going up in the US. That means that there's probably some tailwinds. And if you connect the dots with some of the other economic indicators, we are in for a pretty bad sign there. I'll bring you back to that world map that I showed you again. That's just to reinforce my point that everywhere you see in blue, all those places in Europe where it's going to be a cold winter with very little energy, very little underwear sales in all those places in blue as well. So I do feel sorry for the men in Europe. Now, are we heading towards a global recession? We don't think we'll have a global recession in 2022. We think that by and large, central banks have got things under control. The risks are concentrated in 2023. So we do know what the risks are. Continued war in Ukraine, things have adjusted. Commodity prices are high, inflation, cost of living crisis everywhere. Governments are trying to deal with this. So we do know the risks and we have to monitor. But at the EIU, we think that we will narrowly avoid a global recession next year. But whatever it is, that benign, beautiful environment pre-2018 where there was low inflation, low interest rates, US and China weren't fighting, that period is gone. We are in a period of increased uncertainty and increased pressure on GDP growth. Now let's take a very quick look at Asia. So on the left-hand chart here, you'll see growth for the next 5 years in Asia. So Vietnam, Bangladesh, Philippines, and Indonesia will be the 4 fastest growing countries in Southeast Asia and in Asia. Of course, Indonesia growing pretty fast, but it is the biggest of those 4 economies as well. So that tells you something. Basically, one thing to take away from this slide is China is smack in the middle, right? It used to be right on top. For the last 15 years, China was always on top of this list. And now it is in the middle. China does provide a lot of economic support in terms of its insatiable demand for products around Southeast Asia. It's a big export market. And because of the China slowdown, we are feeling the pinch somewhat here in Asia as well. So here we do depend still a lot on China. Those 2 graphs on the right-hand side, one is US investments in Southeast Asia, and you can see that it's still much larger, of course, but the Chinese really have come in across a lot of other countries in recent years, right? So the pace of Chinese investment in Asia is very quick. But we do rely on both of these countries for trade in the region. Now, going to China, because it's so important, I need to talk about it a little bit. Zero COVID policy is the thing to watch in China. Because doors are still closed there and they have lockdowns, it is really hurting their economic growth. Now, we all know here in Jakarta, in Southeast Asia, what it looks like to come out of the pandemic. You know, you tell people to get vaccinated. Once you have a lot of people who are vaccinated, you tell them, okay, we can open the doors, you can come out slowly. And the rhetoric of the governments and of businesses changes, right? That hasn't changed yet in China. So we don't expect that zero COVID will change fundamentally or quickly in the next 6 months. Now, of course, we'll have to see what's going on during the Party Congress in October and November, but we don't expect that to change. China's economy is going through a long-term downward secular trend, right? So it is becoming a big economy, so it's growing slower. We expect a bit of a bounce next year, but structural things like the property crisis, like youth unemployment, are really weighing on China's economy. But the good news is that if it does change its zero COVID policy, growth will come back very quickly. This is to show you also that during the pandemic, a lot of supply chains changed, right? So out of China, many companies wanted to have a China +1 or China +2 strategy. And so they moved to Vietnam, they moved to India, they moved to Bangladesh. Here are some tech companies that have not only moved, but also added second production facilities or second or third production facilities out of China. 10 years ago, if you wanted to add another production facility, it will probably still be in China, but now that has changed. Very quickly at Indonesia, where, as I said in the beginning, this is a bright spot not only in the world, but in Southeast Asia as well. I think Prakash mentioned about the GDP growth. It's very good this year, up to 5.4%. In Q2, it was 5.2%. And you can see that blue line really kind of going up for Indonesia. That is mostly on the back of the commodities story, but there's also been increased manufacturing, increase in digital economy as well, and all of that is adding to GDP growth in Indonesia. When firms make their profits, they also invest it back into the economy, and so the long-term prospects look good. Bank of Indonesia has done a very good job. They raised inflation, they raised their interest rates to combat inflation pretty quickly, much faster than other Southeast Asian and actually other global economies, and so they are in a pretty good position. We think that they will still have room to increase the interest rate a bit more, but they are sort of in control of that 4.5, 4.6% inflation. As you all know, about a month ago, fuel subsidies were also removed. That's a very big step in the Indonesian economy. Doing something like that is taking the pain now and kind of redistributing the way that you're supporting populations and families that are in need of that support, right? So it's also a sign of the confidence that the government has in the economy to be able to remove a subsidy like that. Again, a lot of lines here. Let me just draw your attention to the red color line, which is the rupiah, right? And all the rest are other currencies that are in Southeast Asia and Asia. And as you can see, the rupiah has gone down a little bit, and then now it is going to track upwards from there. Traditionally, when the US increases its interest rates, it has a very bad effect on currencies in Southeast Asia and on the rupiah as well. In 2014, 2015, that was the last time we saw a lot of flight out of Indonesia, of Indonesian capital, when the Fed raised its interest rates. That's not happening now. That's a very good sign. The rupiah has been the second best or the best performing currency in Southeast Asia. We expect that it will depreciate just a little bit more until the end of the year, but will generally then start tracking upwards. And if you think about it, the pound at a record low, the euro at a 20-year low, the Japanese yen at a 20-year low, the Korean won at a 15-year low, the rupiah is very, very strong, and that has good impact on your business planning and thinking about what's ahead for the future. Political risks in Asia, Indonesia does look very stable. As I mentioned, the popularity as well of the government under Jokowi allows it to make big policy steps like removing the subsidies. Of course, there are protests and things like that, but because the government is popular, it's been able to absorb a lot of that. Jokowi's methodology has been this big tent process where he gets many of his political competitors to be involved in policy making, and that, even though there have been some policy missteps, has generally been good for policy making. Things like that are very ambitious, like moving the capital and the omnibus law, could have good effects on the business environment if he's able to push those very ambitious goals through in the next 18 months. Whatever the case, whoever takes over in the next 18 months will not be like Jokowi, will not be a political outsider, but we do think that whoever that person is, who's the new president, will continue this policy of big tent policy making because it has served Jokowi's administration pretty well. Indonesia, EV battery production hub, has the world's largest or second largest reserves of nickels, and that's very good for battery production. The nickel that you get in the ground in Indonesia is of a lower quality, which means that you have to build higher energy, higher capital, more sophisticated factories to then process that nickel. That could potentially be a good thing because you could have spillover effects into other industries when you set up factories that are sort of more sophisticated and more technologically ready. Can Indonesia then extend that to become more of an automotive hub? That's something that we will watch. Part of the infrastructure is not there, but it's certainly giving itself quite a lot of opportunity to do that, given its current government policies around processing and not removing the materials so quickly. What trends? Oh, hang on. I have something on the Indonesian consumer. They are very optimistic. See, all you have to take away from this graph is the dark blue is optimism, the light blue is mixed optimism, and black is pessimistic. Indonesian consumers are amongst the most optimistic in the world. Only Indian consumers are more optimistic than Indonesian consumers. Among them, millennials, baby boomers, and people who are vaccinated are the most optimistic of all Indonesian consumers. We've also seen from Google mobility data that two things have happened. During the pandemic, there's a lot of digital transformation, and people started shopping online, e-commerce went up. But after the pandemic, footfall in retail, footfall in restaurants and other types of recreational facilities has really increased by quite a lot. And so both of those trends are working, and that's something that I think you should pay attention for when you're looking for different types of indicators about consumers. Now, looking through the world, what are all that I've told you about is our main assumption, right? Our view on how the economy will grow in the next 5-year period. What could change that? Cold winter worsens Europe's energy crisis. If there's a colder winter, they'll need more coal. That will drive prices up. That will cost governments a lot more. That might drag the recession there for a bit longer. The other thing that we are looking for in Asia is, of course, China's zero policy. I talked about that, zero COVID policy. And then the final one is the Taiwan Straits, right? So after Nancy Pelosi's visit, there have been a lot more naval and military exercises in the Straits. that increases the chance of something accidental happening that may disrupt supply chains or shipping routes temporarily. So that's another thing that we look at when we are looking at some risks for the global economy. Transition policies face energy security headwinds. So, Prakash talked about sustainability. What we are seeing, and I think this is very important for the region, is a divergence between short-term needs for the green transition and long-term needs. In Europe now, they just need all the energy they can, no matter what color it is, whether it's green or gray or black, because they simply just need it to keep people warm and to keep their industries going. So in the short term, we do see that carbon emissions will increase in Europe, but over the medium and long term, renewable energy has a geopolitical discount, right? You don't have to ship it across borders by and large, and so the ability to have that and manufacture that in your own country becomes a big source of resilience for economies. Now in Asia, we are very bad, right? Those are the big countries in Asia: China, India, Japan, Indonesia. In red there, we are carbon emitters. And so I feel that a big conversation has to happen around, how do we change this and how do we approach this? COP27 is happening in a few weeks. That's going to be top of the agenda. But as we are searching for growth, the other point is that growth for good, right? How do we make sure that growth is sustainable? And that's something that we'll have to grapple with, even as this economic opportunity is abound in Indonesia. And this is my last slide. Who will be the economic powers of tomorrow? On the left-hand side is economic powers in 2020. So you see US, China, Japan, Germany on top. India, I think, in 6th place. Can you see Indonesia there towards the bottom, right? I think like 5th or 6th towards the bottom. And then look forward to 2020. Who are the economic powers of tomorrow? China overtakes US sometime in 20 or 2035. But then look at Indonesia. It's the 6th biggest economy in the world in 2020. That's driven by urbanization, by the digital economy, and the assumption that it will be able to improve its business environment as well. But other countries in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, are there, and Bangladesh are there as well. So the future looks pretty bright for Indonesia. And in this time of very complex and uncertain economic outlook, Indonesia seems to be pretty resilient, all things considered. And so I'll leave you with that and that kind of background to take with you throughout the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.